Snow erased the edges of Khyber Valley and turned distance into a white wall. Wind pressed at 20 to 30 miles per hour, with bursts near 40. Carving sheets of ice across rock, the air held a hard bite between -15 and -22 degrees Fahrenheit. In that noise and cold, Staff Sergeant Claire Dawson settled into work that asked for eyes only and nothing more. She wore the quiet of a Marine who had spent years learning how to vanish without leaving a ripple. Her call sign was Bishop 7, and today she was assigned independent reconnaissance with rules that were plain. Observe and report only. Radio on, receive only. No proactive engagement. Defensive fire was permitted only if a threat came directly for her hide. The chain of command moved like a spine behind her. Lieutenant Colonel Adam Whitaker held the battalion, 2D Battalion 5th Marines. Steady against the storm and the map, Captain Noah Mercer owned Bravo Company and carried the responsibility that comes with being the one nearest the ground truth. First Lieutenant Tyler Brooks floated between the role of company executive officer and platoon leader when gaps opened. A reliable hinge where friction gathered. Sergeant Ethan Park led a standard 13 Marine squad that had already learned what whiteout means for spacing, for voices, for the simple act of keeping a line straight. Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class Miguel Rivera moved with them. A Navy hospital corpsman who kept gauze and calm in the same pocket. Major Karen Bishop ran battalion operations. Eyes on the nets and the weather and the hard limits that weather writes. Colonel Laura Keating watched from the regiment. And the division operations voice that bled over secure channels belonged to General Thomas Hale. None of that changed the ceiling that sagged low enough to scrape the ridgelines. Icing had already put small, unmanned systems on the ground. RQ-20 Puma crews, waiting with batteries warming against their sleeves. Air crews kept their birds staged and ready. But H-1Y and CH-53E teams watched numbers that did not yet line up. Wind, ceiling, visibility. The math was not on their side. Bishop 7 lay prone in a pocket of rock that broke the gusts into a rough rhythm. She built small comfort into the cold where she could. Hand warmers nested against the bolt to keep the throw smooth and predictable. A detail that mattered when fingers went numb and metal stiffened. Muzzle tape kept snow out without changing point of impact. A scrap of logic in a place that wanted to fill every hollow with ice. Her rifle was the Mk-13 Mod 7 chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. The suppressor was checked and seated. A simple insurance against flash and signature in low light and bright snow. The optic was a Night Force ATACR with magnification set to a practical middle. Bubble level, centered, to keep Cant honest. The tripod clamped to an Arca rail and took the work out of muscles that would otherwise shake. Not from fear, but from exposure and wind. Dawson kept a dope card in a waterproof sleeve and treated her lenses with a film to keep fog from blooming with every breath. A Kestrel 5700 with applied ballistics hung where she could read it without moving her head too far off the gun. She preferred to trust the valley, though, to see snow streamers and leeward curls and the way drift gathered in the lee of a broken boulder. Passive range-finding and careful terrain study gave her the numbers she needed without throwing energy into the air. The order set was tight and left no room for ambition. Radio receive only. Report when possible through pre-planned windows or courier. Do not engage unless forced by immediate threat. It was repeated in briefings and again at the lip of the valley. Sometimes with a tone that said she was just eyes and not a shooter today. Sometimes with a reminder that heroics get people killed when systems are stretched thin. She let the words pass through the same filter as the cold. Staff officers preferred quiet assets that stayed in their box. Seniors who had never lain prone on a mountainside during a whiteout tended to frame her as a sensor rather than a Marine with a rifle. She kept no resentment, only a steady accounting of what was needed and what was allowed. The work had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with returning more people than the weather planned to take. The valley argued with every plan. Snow fell in wet bursts that turned dry as the gusts spiked, and the ground crusted under a skin that broke at the edges. Tracks filled in minutes, then iced over. Sound moved strangely, carrying a cough toward the ridgeline and burying a shout 10 feet away. From the battalion net, the cadence was clipped and professional. Major Bishop issued updates that sounded like simple math, and the math rarely smiled. Colonel Keating asked for what could be verified, and nothing more. General Hale came across a secure channel long enough to confirm that division assets would not risk a blind ingress until numbers shifted out of the red. Captain Mercer kept Bravo Company under cover and out of trouble as much as a map in a storm would allow. First Lieutenant Brooks moved between positions on foot, turning guidance into ground truth whenever a radio turned to static. Sergeant Park kept the 13 Marine Squad tight, adjusting spacing so that a stumble would not become a chain reaction. Corpsman Rivera watched for shivering that turned to silence, for pale faces that stopped feeling their own noses. Dawson worked through her list and then worked it again. Wind brackets went on the card in pencil with a soft hand that would write even when the temperature forced a glove. Natural point of aim was checked and checked again until the rifle pointed itself. She set holds for likely ranges along the draw, not because she planned to press the trigger, but because not planning was a kind of negligence that her job did not permit. She kept reminding herself that defensive necessity was a narrow lane. Defensive meant the threat came for her hide directly. Not that she saw a bad pattern forming where Bravo Company might be squeezed. Observing meant study and relay as time and conditions allowed. It did not mean solving the math with a bullet just because the math felt solvable. Staff voices had a way of attaching definitions to her role. Some of them said she was a camera with a heartbeat, and that was fine. The camera would stay patient. Others said she was a safety net, the last layer of warning before people stepped into a hole they could not see. She let the frames pass and stayed with her own simple one. Find, confirm, ASBAS, stay alive. The whiteout tightened in the afternoon, or what passed for afternoon when the sun was a diffuse smear behind the ceiling. Gusts, near 40, shoved a sheet of snow across her scope and left small ridges like frozen waves against the lip of the hide. She blinked and breathed and kept the glass clear with slow movements that did not bloom steam. Every motion had to be worth the heat it cost. Her position offered a slant view of the valley floor and the opposing ridge where rock and scrub broke into pockets that could hide people with bad intentions. She marked likely PKM positions not as certainties, but as questions waiting for a better answer. She drew a thin marker where a forward observer might stand to watch arcs, then underlined the place where a comms node would hide from wind and still keep line of sight. None of it carried the implied promise of a shot. The kit hummed with restraint. Suppressor seated, bubble level even. Kestrel ready, but second to what the valley told her. Tripod legs dug in without rattling, and the rifle sat the way a tool sits in a hand that has used it for years. She felt the familiar quiet pressure that came with orders that asked her to be a sensor first and a Marine second. It was not an insult so much as a choice that kept other choices clean. When everyone is cold and tired, clear lanes keep lives from twisting together in the wrong way. She accepted the boundary and settled into it. The radio hissed with a wash of static that rode the wind and settled back. Dawson kept it on receive and did not thumb the push to talk. She formed messages in her head, kept them organized, and waited for windows that might open if sealing and icing shifted for even a small slice of time. Patience, more than any mark on a qualifications card, was the currency that bought survival in a storm like this. Her hands moved through one last cycle of checks as light bled out of the valley and the white turned blue. She touched the tape at the muzzle and confirmed the seal. She felt the bolt throw and let the hand warmer keep the metal obedient and smooth. She looked at the dope card and placed it where a glove could find it without thinking. There were people on the net who would never see her as anything but eyes. She was fine with that. Eyes are what keep a unit from walking into the wrong fold in the terrain. Eyes are what hold the line when the sky refuses to help. Khyber Valley breathed, and the storm deepened. Icing kept RQ-20 Puma on the ground. An H-1Y and CH-53E crews watched a ceiling that refused to climb. Bravo Company held to the places that hurt least. And the battalion kept a steady hand on the net. The regiment and division listened for numbers that might shift. Dawson pressed herself lower in the hide as a fresh gust moved powder across the opening and softened the world to a smear. The rifle sat quiet and ready. But readiness was not invitation. Her job was to know, not to act. Her discipline kept the line clear. She watched, measured, and recorded while the valley hid its edges. She kept radio receive only and let the net flow through her without adding to the noise. The rule not to shoot lived in her hands and in her breath, not just in the words of a briefing. The night took hold, and Bishop 7 remained still. A set of eyes anchored to a promise she intended to keep. The wind worked the ridgeline like a saw, and the cold sat heavy on the bones. Claire Dawson slid into her Overwatch pocket and let the slope hold her weight instead of muscle. She eased her breathing until it matched the push and pull of the gusts. Slow inhale. Slow exhale. A cadence that made the world shrink to the glass and the rifle and the white valley below. She checked natural point of aim first, because everything else depends on that quiet truth. Hips square to the bore line. Toes relaxed. Shoulders soft. The rifle pointing itself without effort. She closed her eyes for a breath and opened them to confirm that the reticle had not drifted. Only when the crosshair settled where it wanted to live did she move on. The Night Force AT-CR sat snug against the receiver. Magnification parked at a sensible middle that let her track movement without tunnel vision. She centered the bubble level and held it there for a count as the wind nudged at the barrel. Cant is a thief in a place like this. So she starved it early. She cracked the focus just enough to keep Mirage honest when the wind lulled. Dry fire came next. A handful of steady presses to feel the trigger wall and the clean break. She rode the shoe straight back and watched the reticle for any twitch that might betray her position behind the gun. Cold fingers lie when they get stiff. So, she told them the story again until they remembered. The follow-through was quiet and disciplined, and the reticle stayed still. She rolled off and brought the bolt fully to the rear. Chamber check-in. Chamber check-out. A visual and tactile confirmation that cost seconds and bought certainty. The magazines lined in her pouch were magazines and nothing else. Each marked for lot. Each seated and tugged before being stowed again. She glanced at the suppressor shoulder and verified alignment because small mistakes get loud in the mountains. The tripod took the load the way an old friend does. Arca rail locked. Legs dug into crust until the head felt like a hinge instead of a spring. She sank the rear bag and let gravity settle the rifle into a calm she could feel through her cheek. When the wind hit the rock, the tripod shrugged and passed only a fraction of the shiver to glass. She slid a palm over the Kestrel 5700 and woke it without lifting her head too far. Density altitude read low enough to make air feel thick and honest for a 300 Winchester Magnum. She logged the number to the dope card and then looked away from the screen because the valley tells more than a device. Snow streamers traced invisible rivers, and the downwind sides of boulders gave away their eddies. Lens discipline mattered as much as any chart. She shaded the objective to kill stray glare and wiped a thin film that kept the glass from fogging when her breath pooled under the hood. A small square of tape sat firm over the muzzle so blown snow would not choke the bore. Nothing flashy. Just small decisions that kept bigger problems from stacking up. Her rangefinder stayed in passive mode and lived under a flap where it would not glitter. She measured with terrain instead of light and built ranges from handrail features she had walked before the weather shut down movement. A draw that ran true for 200 yards. A shoulder of rock that broke at the same height as a stunted pine. Confirmation without invitation. She wrote the dope with a pencil that would not turn brittle in the cold. Elevation for likely lanes. Wind brackets that made sense for a valley that punished guesses. The card wrote in a sleeve that sealed against meltwater. And she slid it into a pocket she could open with a glove, without looking. The radio was on receive only, and sat just outside her collar, so she could hear net traffic without breaking position. Battalion still sounded steady through the static, and Captain Mercer kept his people tucked, where terrain offered a spine. First, Lieutenant Brooks moved pieces and filled gaps when the wind tore holes in the plan. None of it called for her voice. CPL Avery Cole dropped by on the last pass before the whiteout finished the sky and gave her a long look that said the setup was too much for a day when she was not supposed to press a trigger. The comment came out easy. A friendly jab about overkill that carried more warmth than doubt. She let it land and offered a small nod. Not because he was right, but because a nod weighs nothing and buys quiet. When he eased away, the hide felt smaller and cleaner. The cold always wanted more than anyone planned to give. She slid a hand warmer against the bolt body to keep the throw smooth and the feel consistent. The metal gave back a soft promise when she worked it. In a few hours, that promise would be the difference between confident motion and a sticky hitch that robs seconds. She resettled behind the gun and went back to natural point of aim to confirm nothing had drifted while she moved. Bubble level centered. Sling tension even. Shoulder pressure light enough that the buttstock rested rather than pressed. The wind wrote its own language on the slope, and she studied the verbs. Streamers curled, then snapped flat, then softened again as a gust rolled down a chute like a slow wave. The kestrel numbers lined up with what she saw, but the eyes stayed senior to the screen. She plotted where the air would lie to her and where it might give her a clean pause. She kept her hands simple and her thoughts simpler. Count the rhythm. Note the lulls. Mark the pushes that come with the gusts and how long they last. The valley becomes predictable if you do not rush the relationship. Her check of the magazines was not about faith. She weighed them by hand and felt the rounds shift. Then rechecked feed lips by touch. She seated one and tugged it again and felt the click settle into a habit she trusted. Every small confirmation kept her ready without moving her closer to a line she would not cross. Night dragged the light to blue and then dimmed it to something flatter. She eased the magnification down a notch to widen her view and kept the reticle centered against a landmark she could find in low contrast. Movement means nothing if you cannot find it again after a blink. She trained her eye to slide across lanes in a loop that never left her lost. She turned back to the dope card and added a final row of wind brackets that spoke in tenths of a mil. Left 0.2 to left 1.0 for the near lane. Left 0.3 to left 1. 0.2 for the far shelf when the streamers lay flat for 4 seconds. A quiet reminder to add a touch of spin drift correction when pushes ran long and steady. She did not plan to use any of it now. The rifle lay quiet. The valley hummed with weather and gravity and the small groans that rock makes when it breathes. She settled her cheek, confirmed the level, and watched the air climb and fall along the ridgeline. Skill is patient when it knows it may not be asked to act. Her heart rate eased back to the pace she trusted on long nights. 3 slow breaths. A scan. A listen to the net. Then back to the glass. The pattern built its own comfort even as the temperature leaned harder into the teens below zero. Routine is a shelter when tents and aircraft are still only plans. Somewhere behind her, the company shifted and resettled its weight. And the squad leaders moved their people by inches. She kept her place and her silence. A small node in a network that works best when everyone stays in their lane. Whatever comes next will not forgive sloppy habits. She left none on the table. The last mark she made was small and neat at the edge of the card. A bracket set for the most common wind she had read that hour, with a note to account for that slight right drift past 1,000 meters if the air stabilized. It was a hint to a future she might or might not meet. Then she slid the card away and let the valley have the next move. The ridge sat between Dawson and the valley like a folded blade. She set her hide 3 to 4 miles by line of sight from Bravo and checked that the snow-covered spines did not break her view. Wind pushed at 20 to 30 miles per hour, with gusts near 40. And the air lay hard at -15 to -22 degrees Fahrenheit. The low ceiling dragged like wet canvas and turned distance into a pale smear. Her radio stayed on, receive only as ordered. She listened to the net settle into a steady beat that sounded calm on the surface and tight underneath. Observe and report was the rule, and it meant patience without exceptions. She kept her push-to-talk under a fold of fabric and treated it like a tripwire. She built her position the way a carpenter lays a straight line. The tripod took the weight and leveled the rifle so the glass could rest instead of hunt. She placed a soft shield over the objective lens to keep glare down and fought frost with quiet care. Every movement was small and slow, so heat would last. Small, unmanned systems stayed grounded at the forward sight. RQ-20 Puma crews waited with batteries warmed inside jackets, while icing made flight a bad bet. Electro-optical eyes could not see clean. And infrared saw only a muddied wash that hinted at shapes without detail. Air crews for H-1Y and CH-53E watched numbers that refused to give them a safe window. Dawson sketched the valley by hand and let the pencil decide what mattered. She shaded a shelf where a PKM could rake the floor, then circled a second angle that looked too convenient to ignore. She gave the draw near the north wall a careful look and marked the place where a forward observer would stand to walk rounds. A small box became a likely comms node tucked behind rock that still held line of sight. None of this changed her rule. Not a shooter today. Defensive fire, only if a threat moved on her hide. The rest was study and quiet and the slow building of a picture that might outlast the weather. She kept her breathing low and steady and let the scope ride the rhythm. Streamers of blown snow drew the wind like chalk on a board, pulling left across one saddle and slipping downslope at another. The kestrel on her chest confirmed low-density altitude and matched what her eyes already believed. She noted it on the card and then went back to the ridge because the ridge rarely lies. Bravo Company held in the bottom where terrain made a bowl. 50 Marines pressed into cover and watched the angles that mattered, while Captain Noah Mercer kept the order to hold position if possible. The battalion net carried Lieutenant Colonel Adam Whitaker, asking for weather updates that could open a door that was not yet there. Patience carried a cost that everyone could feel in their shoulders. She checked range by reading terrain instead of sending light. A shoulder of rock that stepped twice before it fell to the floor. A scar of avalanche that crossed the bowl at a fixed height. Handrail features gave her numbers without a trace. Electro-optical devices on nearby posts showed flickers that meant movement without pattern. Infrared saw heat blooms through the storm. But edges bled and shapes swam when the gusts rose. Nothing in the feed rose to the level of a call that would burn the net for little gain. She filed it all away and kept her lane clean. She drew the first probable PKM nest a second time with a thinner line. The shelf carried a field of fire that made sense and a back route that would hide a small resupply. The second nest looked more like a decoy, and she marked it with a question instead of a circle. Questions deserve space until the valley answers. She added a small triangle where a mortar section could sit behind stone and still talk to a forward observer. The spot had cover from wind and a natural backstop for sound. She penciled a thin arrow to a notch in the ridge where a person could watch the floor without showing a wide shoulder. The arrow was a reminder that one set of eyes can turn a bowl into a trap. Her radio broke into a short wash of static and then cleared. The voice of Major Karen Bishop offered a weather line and a reality check about rotor limits. Colonel Laura Keating asked for confirmed data without dressing it with hope. General Thomas Hale came on long enough to confirm division would hold air until the ceiling and icing moved. Dawson kept her finger off the trigger and let the rule live in her hands. She pulled her cheek back and settled it again to make sure natural point of aim stayed true. The bubble level floated even and the reticle rested without a tremor. The habit itself brought heat back to her face. The gusts worked across the ridges in pulses that felt like a clock. She watched the breaks grow a little longer, then snap short again as the valley inhaled and exhaled. With each cycle, she added a pencil mark beside a wind bracket on the card. Left point 2 to left point 8 in the lower lane. Then a small note that streamers reversed near the north wall when gusts peaked. She could see small groups reshaping themselves on the floor whenever the wind pushed a curtain of snow aside. Sergeant Ethan Park kept spacing honest and heads low. And Hospital Corpsman Second Class Miguel Rivera moved like a shadow between rocks. Their restraint told her as much as any broadcast. Experienced hands do not hurry when the sky is not on their side. The day shrank to a dim gray that carried no warmth. She edged magnification down a touch for a wider window and traced a slow loop from shelf to saddle to draw and back again. The loop became a metronome against the wind. It kept her thinking in lanes instead of in guesses. She mapped a quiet path in her mind for an exfil that might come when air finally grew brave. Draw north to saddle west. Then shadow the lee of the broken ridge. The plan did not belong to her, and she let it go once it had sharpened her picture. Knowing the ground is not the same as owning the call. The temperature bit at her wrists where the glove met the sleeve. She flexed her fingers inside the mitt and pressed them against the warm metal near the bolt. The rifle gave back a small kindness. Familiar tools can be a roof when the weather wants to take your edges. Her net stayed busy enough to feel alive and quiet enough to feel alone. The company net kept location updates tight and short. Battalion kept time and weather in a low voice that carried certainty without comfort. Nothing in it bent her rule. She looked again at the comms node mark and added a thin line that connected it to the forward observer perch. 2 points and a taut string can control a bowl like this when the weather helps. If those points were real, they would shape how Bravo felt the day. She kept the thought and left the trigger cold. The ceiling pressed lower and turned the last of the light flat and uniform. She took one more slow tour of the glass and listened to the snow hit her hood in soft drifts. Each new coat made the world smaller by an inch. Small inches add up when you measure a day by breathing in glass. Dawson thought about the narrow lane she had been given and chose it again. Not a shooter today. Radio receive only. Observe and report when wisdom says it is worth the air. She watched the wind for short windows that opened like a blink and closed just as fast. Each window became a note on the card, so a future choice would not have to be rushed. The count did not change the order, but it sharpened her readiness to follow it with a clear head. The clock kept its quiet pace, and she let it run while she stayed still. The plan failed in pieces that were small enough to miss, until they started to add up. Snow poured through the gaps in the ridges and hugged the ground like smoke. The wind pressed at 20 to 30 miles per hour, with spikes near 40, turning every open step into a gamble. The temperature held between -15 and -22 degrees Fahrenheit and bit through layers until movement felt heavy. Bravo Company held the bowl at the bottom because that was the least bad option. 50 Marines pressed into broken rock and dead ground, while Captain Noah Mercer kept the order simple. Hold if possible, until the sky made room for blades. The ceiling stayed low and gray, and the valley kept its grip. Contact showed first as a scatter of impacts that did not make sense on a clean map. Rounds arrived from 2 angles that did not share a rhythm. Then, the pattern locked in, and everyone felt it at once. A PKM on the west shelf tore a line across the lowest cover, and a second nest on the north spur reached across the bowl when the wind eased. The first Marines who tried to shift left found the slope pinned by grazing fire that cut the ground at knee height. The ones who tested the right bank ran into a rake of bursts that hit chest high when the gusts fell off. The draw that had looked open from the map turned into a choke that could be crossed only in a sprint no one could make without help. The exits were not exits anymore. A heavy thump started to walk closer from the far flank. The rounds were lazy at first and fell wide. Then the splash tightened and moved in careful steps. Someone up high saw the bowl and talked a mortar team onto it with patience. Each correction cut the distance like a metronome. Comms began to fray as ice climbed the aerials and the terrain swallowed signals. The company net held but sounded waterlogged. Calls to Alpha went thin and then broke into static. The battalion net was a weak thread that faded every time the gusts threw snow across the ridge. Lieutenant Colonel Adam Whitaker took the weather update and kept the words clean. Hold position if possible. Because the sky was not safe, and icing kept small unmanned systems on the deck. RQ-20 Puma stayed grounded and cold on the line, and the pilots for H-1Y and CH-53E waited for numbers that would not move. The Valley owned the air and the timeline for now. Sergeant Ethan Park counted heads and felt the weight of what was left. A standard 13 Marine squad had bled down to 4 after the first contact and the push to find a gap. He passed the word that ammunition was critical and meant it. The math turned ugly when the squad was outnumbered and the guns up the slope could not be flanked without help. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Miguel Rivera did what training demanded and did it fast. He checked massive bleeding first, locked tourniquets high and tight, and pushed gauze into wounds until the flow slowed. Airway came next when a Marine started to turn quiet. Jaw thrust done with hands that shook from cold and effort. He kept eyes on breathing and circulation and moved the living into better cover while the rounds traced the edges of the rock. Dawson watched from the hide that gave her line of sight across 3 problem angles. The storm ran like a curtain between her glass and the fight. But enough broke through to make sense. She could see a forward observer on a ledge that faced the bowl without exposing a full silhouette. She could see the crude arc of the mortar and the way the team adjusted after each splash. The PKM on the west shelf ran clean bursts and kept the lane across the low ground closed. The second PKM sat higher and reached down the spine of the bowl when the gusts let the tracer fly straight. A small knot of figures moved between them and the draw near the north wall. When they paused, one set of hands worked a handset and turned stillness into direction. Every time a fire team tried a buddy rush without outside pressure, the slope punished them. The first Marine moved and the second Marine fed rounds toward the shelf. But the angle was wrong and the cover was thin. The PKM gunners did not chase with spray. They waited for the move and cut the seam between rocks. Without suppression that bit into the nest, the rush hit a wall and slid down it. The company tried to bend the line in 3 places at once. A pair on the left tested the bank and found ice under the snow that took a knee out from under one Marine. Another pair on the right got caught when the second PKM settled back in after a lull and stitched a line where they needed to breathe. The center tried to inch forward under the rhythm of the mortar, using the slow count between thumps, and ran out of inches. Major Karen Bishop kept the battalion net measured and calm. She called ceiling, visibility, winds, and icing in a cadence that made sense for pilots and commanders. Colonel Laura Keating asked for confirmation before she moved pieces that would catch cold behind the storm for no gain. General Thomas Hale checked the net long enough to say division would release air only when the math turned safe enough to justify the risk. Dawson kept her hands off the trigger and stayed with the rule that had been set for her. Observe and report. Radio receive only. Defensive fire only if a threat walked onto the hide. She worked the card and watched the valley like a test she was not allowed to take. Rivera pulled one Marine back from the edge with a seal on a chest wound that made the breathing less desperate. He shouted a status to a passing team without lifting his head, then moved to the next casualty as the mortar walked 2 steps closer. He moved gauze, tape, and calm like tools that had shapes he knew in the dark. He set a small stack of litter straps beside a Marine who could still help and told him what would come next without words. Park held the last 4 of his squad together with short bursts. short crawls, and shorter calls. He kept people from clumping and kept fields of fire from stacking on top of each other. When one Marine burned too much ammunition into a dead space, he put a hand on the barrel and pulled it down. Ammunition was life, and the map was stealing it. The PKM nests did not fire all the time. They waited for motion and for the mortar to shift focus. Then they cut threads when Marines tried to cross. The forward observer watched with patience, adjusted when he needed to, and let the team settle each step before moving the splash again. The comms node tucked against the rock kept the tempo even when the wind pushed static into the net. Mercer knew the cost of forcing a plan that the ground no longer respected. He kept the hold in place and shaved exposure where he could. He moved a team by 3 body lengths to cut an angle for the machine gun, and he pulled another team back from a pocket where the mortar had started to find them. The plan turned into a set of small corrections that kept people breathing. Dawson mapped the chain of control across the slope like a wire diagram. Forward observer to mortar to PKM to small node where orders moved. If that wire stayed intact, the bowl remained a trap. She let the knowledge live on the card and did not let it climb into her hands. The clock picked up speed in the way a day does when people run out of easy choices. The weather held its line and the sky kept blades away from the bowl. Every minute in the open took heat from hands and attention from eyes. The count of minor wounds became a list of problems that would not stay minor in this cold. The option set tightened. Buddy rush would not earn ground without real suppression on the nests. The mortar would keep walking until it found flesh in the gaps. The company could not push out without blood, and the air could not push in without luck. Dawson watched the wind write small windows across the shelves and counted them without acting. She logged the length of each lull and marked where the streamers changed direction along the north wall. She tracked the times when the mortar team paused to resupply, and the forward observer looked down and wrote. She kept the pattern in her head, where it would not touch the trigger. Whitaker spoke again on the battalion net and kept the guidance steady. Hold position if possible, and stay under cover where the map allows it. The numbers still fought the air, and the air still won. Nobody liked it, but nobody argued. Rivera handed a Marine off to a pair who could move him and slid to the next casualty. Park redistributed ammunition and made a small triangle of fire that kept the nearest shelf honest. Mercer kept the shape of the company tight enough to survive and loose enough to react. It was not a plan anyone wanted, but it was the only one that could live in this bowl. The valley pressed down and made time hard to hold. The exits stayed closed, and the wire that ran from observer to mortar to machine guns hummed with a rhythm that punished motion. Dawson lay in her hide with the radio on receive only and the rule sitting in her hands. She watched the pattern tighten and felt the clock run faster. And she did not break the silence. Snow hissed along the rocks and stitched thin lines across the glass. Claire Dawson stayed prone and let the slope carry her weight instead of muscle. The pattern of her breath set the pace. Slow and steady. Matched to the wind. Steady in. Steady out. Until the world narrowed to the rifle and the lanes of white below. She began with safety because safety is the floor of everything that matters. Bolt to the rear. Chamber check. By sight and touch. Then ease the bolt forward and confirm status again. The suppressor was seated and aligned. No gaps at the shoulder. No chance of a baffle kiss in the cold. Each magazine was checked for feed and seated with a firm tug before sliding back into its pouch. Natural point of aim came next and earned her full attention. Hips square. Toes relaxed. Shoulders soft, so bones carried the rifle instead of muscle fighting it. She let the reticle float. Closed her eyes for a breath. Opened them. And confirmed it had not drifted. The tripod locked into the Arca rail and turned shake into stillness that felt like quiet ground. The Night Force ATACR sat clean and true on the receiver. She centered the bubble level and held it there while a gust leaned on the barrel. Magnification lived in the middle range to keep context honest and avoid the tunnel that hides movement. Focus was set to keep the image crisp without chasing every shimmer in the air. She ran a short string of dry fire to feel the wall and the brake. The trigger pressed straight back, and the reticle stayed steady through the follow-through. Cold tricks fingers into snatching at speed, so she reminded her hands what right felt like. When the rhythm returned, she let the rifle rest and scanned the bowl again. The outside world broke and reformed under fire. Fragments snapped above rock, and snow thumped loose in short, dull slides. The gusts lifted fine powder and packed it again until the footing looked different every minute. Dawson let the noise pass over her like surf and went back to her list. She updated the sketch map with a slow pencil that did not squeak in the cold. The forward observer sat where a ledge gave view and shelter, and she tightened the mark on that perch. The first PKM nest on the west shelf cut low across the floor and pinned the easiest exit. The second nest on the north spur stepped on the path that looked like a rescue until the wind dropped. She boxed the comms node behind a rib of rock where a handset could live without showing a shoulder. A thin line connected node to observer, another to the nests. A simple picture of control. None of it granted permission to act. Observe and report meant patience, and her hands stayed clear of anything that would push her past the line. Electro-optical feeds softened and brightened with each gust and never found a clean edge. Infrared showed shapes that bled at the margins and shifted with the sheets of wind. RQ-20 Puma stayed grounded and cold because icing had its own vote on the plan. H-1Y and CH-53E crews waited on numbers that did not move in their favor. On the floor, Hospital Corpsman Second Class Miguel Rivera worked the steps he had drilled until they lived in his hands. Massive bleeding first, tourniquets high and tight. Then hemostatic gauze worked deep until the flow changed. Airway and breathing came next, with a chest seal where breath leaked and a reassess within moments. He built a small plan for CASEVAC inside the company footprint and waited for a window that the sky refused to give. Sergeant Ethan Park kept what was left of his squad in a tight pattern that did not overlap fields of fire. When a Marine tried to pour rounds into dead space, Park tapped the barrel down and reset the lane. He held bursts short and honest and saved ammunition until suppression could actually buy ground. Every move was small and deliberate and timed to the beats of the mortar. Captain Noah Mercer kept the net calm and clear. Hold position if possible was more than a phrase. It was the only choice that kept people alive until weather turned. He slid teams by body lengths to break angles and pulled others under cover when the splash started to bracket. The plan became a set of disciplined pauses instead of a push. Dawson heard the cadence of Battalion under the static and measured her breathing to it. Lieutenant Colonel Adam Whitaker asked for weather updates that mattered to air and ground. Major Karen Bishop translated the sky into usable numbers and kept hope from dressing itself as fact. The net stayed professional, and she stayed silent with it. Her checklist returned to the rifle. Bolt to the rear. Chamber clear. Bolt forward. Confirm the magazine seated and locked. Sling tension trimmed until the buttstock rested instead of pressed. The bubble level checked again and found center. A small green eye that told the truth without noise. A shard of rock snapped near the hide and skittered into the snow. She eased lower without breaking the tripod and let the gust that brought it pass. The reticle hung where she left it because the foundation was right. She counted the breath, felt her heart slow, and scanned the ridges in a steady loop. The dope card waited under a waterproof sleeve. Edges rounded from hours of use. Elevation for lanes, wind brackets and tenths that matched what the valley kept writing in snow streamers. Density altitude from the kestrel matched the feel of the air in her lungs and the way bullets ride thick cold. She wrote small notes that her hands could read without light if the day went darker. The forward observer looked down after each splash and wrote, then leaned to talk when the team paused to feed the tube. The PKM gunners stayed cool and packaged control into short, deliberate bursts. The node tucked against stone turned stillness into orders at a pace that punished hesitation. The chain held tight, and the bowl stayed closed. Shrapnel hissed closer and raked a groove in crust near her elbow. Dawson kept the trigger finger flat against the stock and away from temptation. She breathed to a count that fit the wind and let the urge to act fade with the gust. Defensive fire would be clean and fast if the threat came to her. But the bowl was not her fight to start. Rivera moved a Marine behind better cover and found a pulse that had started to hide. He warmed frozen hands under his own armpits for a count and went back to work with new grip. He staged litter straps and talked a conscious Marine through what would happen next with a look and a touch. The kit and the steps did not care about the clock. And that steadiness saved minutes. Park spotted a short lull and bought 5 strides with a burst that actually mattered. The team slid into a pocket where rocks stacked just high enough to break the shelf. He returned the line to normal as the gust died and checked faces for the signs that come before mistakes. Cold steals judgment before it steals strength. And he refused to give it either. Mercer shifted an automatic rifle to watch a lane that had been neglected and called a correction that made a difference. Hold position if possible stayed in place. But the shape of the hold sharpened. He kept the company from chasing every noise the wind made. Discipline looked like boredom until it looked like survival. Dawson let herself think at the edges of the rule without stepping past it. Forward observer. Mortar. PKM. Node. A wire that ran clean across the slope and turned motion into pressure. She recorded what she could and ignored what she could not confirm without guessing. Knowledge did not have to become action to stay useful. She confirmed one last time. Bolt status known. Chamber check complete. Magazine seated and firm. The storm pressed its weight back onto the ridge and turned the valley to a flat gray. Dawson stayed in receive only and let the net wash through the hood without reaching for the push to talk. She kept her finger clear of the trigger and her mind clear of the kind of hurry that breaks hands. If the threat came for the hide, she would answer in one clean motion. If it did not, she would keep watching until the sky finally opened. The decision did not arrive as a shout. It came as a slow, cold weight that settled in Claire Dawson's chest while the wind worked the ridge. She watched the pattern tighten in the bowl and felt the math turn against 50 Marines who had run out of easy choices. Orders said, observe and report. Radio, on receive only. Defensive fire only if the threat came to her. The forward observer on the ledge stopped being a shape and became a problem with a clock. Each correction tightened the walk of the mortar and pressed Marines closer to rock that could not grow any taller. 2 PKM nests owned the exits and cut movement into short, punished tries. A small knot at the node turned stillness into tempo and held the chain together. Down in the cold. Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class Miguel Rivera ran out of hemostatic gauze and replaced speed with triage that hurts to make. Sergeant Ethan Park called ammunition critical and forced his people to choose bursts that mattered or none at all. Captain Noah Mercer kept hold position if possible because the sky stayed closed and the battalion needed someone alive to receive the window. Lieutenant Colonel Adam Whitaker waited for numbers that would let H-1Y or CH-53E risk blades in a valley that ate aircraft. Dawson measured her breath to the wind and put the first piece of the choice into place. Bolt to the rear and chamber check by sight and touch. Then ease it forward and confirm status. The suppressor sat tight against the shoulder with no gap. No chance for a strike when metal stiffened. Each magazine was weighed by hand and seated with a firm tug in the pouch where it would ride. She set the tripod so the Arca rail locked without a shake and let the legs bite into crust. Rear bag under the stock. Cheek weld, light and repeatable. Natural point of aim confirmed with eyes closed. Then open to see the reticle unchanged. The bubble level floated even and told her the rifle would not lie about gravity. The night force sat at sensible magnification, so context did not vanish when focus sharpened. She woke the kestrel with a thumb and rate a density altitude that kept bullets honest and heavy. Numbers went on the card, but eyes stayed senior to any screen. Snow streamers showed 2 lanes of wind, a surface push that slid left, and a higher curl that kicked the far shelf. She drew wind brackets in tenths and kept space for the lulls that came like held breath. The radio stayed where it belonged, receive only and quiet under her collar. Battalion still sounded measured in the static and held the line that the sky demanded. Regiment asked for confirmation without painting hope as fact. Division stayed with the math that said no aircraft until icing and sealing moved at the same time. Her pencil built the chain she would cut if she broke the rule. Observer first to blind the mortar, then the west shelf PKM to open the lowest exit, then the north spur PKM to kill the rake that punished right side movement. The comms node would come last to pull the spine out of the tempo and let panic replace control. Each mark carried a cost she understood and did not pretend away. She ran dry fire because the body forgets when cold makes hands lie. Press straight back. Feel the wall. Break clean. Reticle quiet. Follow through, honest. The count returned, and the urge to hurry drained from her fingers. Calm is the only gift she could bring to a choice that would live in her record. The bowl shifted again. The forward observer leaned into the handset, and the mortar walked a step closer with the kind of care that feels like inevitability. A team on the floor stole 3 strides and paid with a near miss they could not afford to repeat. Rivera pressed a chest seal and braced a shoulder against rock to make breathing easier while snow burned his knuckles. There is a place where orders and outcomes meet and stop shaking hands. Dawson knew she had reached it when the lulls she had timed turned into chances that would matter to people who had run out of time. She pulled her hand off the radio entirely and tucked the push to talk deeper under fabric. If she acted, she would not explain it on a hot mic. Safety is not only a control, it is a promise. She confirmed bolt status again, verified suppressor alignment again, and seated the working magazine again. She trimmed sling tension so the stock rested in the pocket and did not press hunger into the shot. The bubble level settled back to center after the gust eased and said the barrel would point where the math thought it would. She marked the wind brackets one more time and wrote a small note about the streamers that flattened for 4 slow seconds on the far shelf. The kestrel number for wind matched the streamers when the valley inhaled and gave a brief peace. She circled that pause and let herself accept that windows could be read and used without apology. The valley would not give many. The plan lived in 3 clean steps and 1 final cut. Blind the mortar by taking the observer on the ledge who had settled into a rhythm. Slice the west shelf PKM and give Park a lane that did not punish a buddy rush before it began. Remove the north spur PKM and pull teeth from the rake that ate the right bank when gusts fell. Only then touch the node and snap the chain that turned calm into pressure. She adjusted the lens shade to keep glare off the glass and wiped a thin film to stop fog from blooming with each breath. Muzzle tape sat where it should, a simple guard against the snow that tried to choke the bore. The rear bag took weight without forcing angle and made the trigger feel like a choice instead of labor. Every piece settled into quiet, and the quiet felt like truth. Down in the bowl, Park laced a short burst that bought 2 bodies a better pocket. Mercer shifted an automatic rifle to a lane that had gone soft and called a correction that saved steps. Rivera staged a litter and pressed warm palms to skin that had gone flat and gray. The clock did not slow for any of it. Dawson let the moral part of the choice walk through her in plain terms. If she did nothing, the chain would keep walking the mortar in, and the nests would keep cutting motion into losses. If she took the shots, she would cross the boundary that defined her role and risk a court-martial that could end her work for good. If she waited for the threat to come to her hide, she would obey the letter and fail the people who would not reach the window. She set her cheek to the stock and felt her heartbeat settle between breaths. 3 slow cycles to clear the noise that lives between thinking and doing. She found the ledge again at a magnification that would not steal the space around it. She checked natural point of aim by closing her eyes and opening them to see the reticle where she left it. The wind softened for the length of a short count, and the streamers went flat on the far shelf. She did not move. She let the lull pass, then marked it on the card so the pattern would not need to be guessed again. Patience is not delay when it makes the next moment true. She slid the working hand to the safety and felt the detent without moving it. The promise she held said she would not fire unless the threat came to her. But the reality pressed that promise against 50 lives. She did not take solace in either side. The choice had to stand on its own feet. The observer leaned forward again and wrote. The mortar team paused for a heartbeat and fed the tube with the smooth rhythm of people who had practiced in weather worse than this. The nests watched, patient, and then punctured motion when Marines tried to steal ground. The nodes sent the beat down the wire as if nothing would break it. Dawson settled the reticle against the ledge and breathed to the bottom of the cycle. She felt the clean line of the trigger through the glove and told her finger to wait. She glanced the bubble level and saw a center. She checked the wind bracket she had circled for this exact lull. She moved her thumb to the safety and took it off without a sound. The radio stayed muted by design and by intent. The card wrote under her cheek with a small note about spin drift that would matter at this angle and range. She accepted that any shot would live on her, not on the net. The last thought she allowed was simple and not dramatic. A weapon is a responsibility, not a wish. If the valley handed her one true window, and the math said lives could be pulled back from the edge, she would act and carry the cost. If the window lied, she would own that too. The wind eased, and the streamers flattened in the place she had circled. She pressed her shoulder just enough to feel the stock become a part of her. The hide stayed still, and the rifle felt weightless in the way good position makes it feel. She took one more breath and held the pause that lives between a choice and the sound that follows. The lull arrived like a held breath that finally settled. Claire Dawson let the sight picture grow still and kept her mind quiet. She felt the stock sit lightly in her shoulder and the tripod carry the weight without complaint. The first shot belonged to the ledge, where the observer had written every step of pain into the bowl. She ran her cadence in 3 clean steps without hurry. Confirm meant range and wind agreed with what the ridge already told her. Adjust meant a calm mill hold with a touch for spin drift and a small note in her head about Coriolis. Solve meant a smooth press during the respiratory pause and a follow-through that did not let the reticle jump. Impact lived as a feeling before it lived as a certainty. The ledge went from purpose to absence. The mortar team reached for correction and found silence where a voice had been. The next round fell wide, and then the rhythm stopped, pretending it had order. Dawson slid off the rifle and moved 10 yards along a seam of rock. She kept her profile under the lip and shielded the glass with the back of her hand. Snow whispered over the muzzle and died against the tape. She built position again and made sure natural point of aim returned to the same honest place. The West Shelf machine gun became the next problem on purpose. Its bursts punished any body that tried to steal space along the low lane. She watched streamers fall flat across the shelf and let the Kestrel verify what her eyes already trusted. Confirm. Adjust. Solve. And then she stayed on the glass just long enough to call her own impact inside her head. The shelf changed in one beat. The low lane belonged to no one for a long second, which was enough for movement to matter. On the floor, fire control shifted from hiding to exploiting. Short rushes assigned to a lane that had become real. The silence felt wrong and right in the same moment because people who had been pinned could finally breathe. She moved again along the rocks, and this time ate 30 yards because angles matter more than comfort. The wind tugged and then let go, and her bubble level found center with a small, patient float. She checked sling tension. eased a breath out, and let the North Spur machine gun come into perfect relief while its partner stayed quiet. The second machine gunner had waited for his moment like a professional. When Marines used the pause on the low lane, he tried to rake the right bank and steal it back. Dawson let him settle and counted the beats she had learned from watching his first minutes of work. Confirm. Adjust. Solve. And then hold the reticle still through recoil as if time had forgotten to move. The right bank stopped being a rake that cut people in half. A pair of Marines slid into a pocket that had always been there, but had been too dangerous to touch. Sergeant Ethan Park shifted his triangle of fire and let a short burst cover a 5-stride jump that would have been suicide an hour earlier. The bowl stopped feeling like a trap built from 3 hands and a map. Dawson checked the clock in her head without chasing numbers. The entire chain would have to be addressed inside a window that belonged to weather and luck and discipline. She reminded herself that the plan lived inside 3 simple metrics that had been true all day. Distance stayed between 900 and 1,300 meters. Wind ran from 20 to 30 miles per hour with short lulls. And the full work would live inside 45 to 60 minutes. She drilled the reticle back to known and made sure natural point of aim had not slipped during the last move. The tripod took a deeper bite into crust, as if the mountain had decided to help for once. She kept her eye relaxed enough to see the hills breathe and not overcorrect every flicker in the glass. The comms node waited inside its small fortress of rock and stillness. The node was the spine that turned scattered men into pressure. Dawson watched the handset rise and fall and measured the pace of posture that spells decision. She waited for the wind to flatten the streamers in that small cut where air always took a breath. Confirm. Adjust. Solve. And the sound inside her head said it was clean. The slope did not crumble into chaos all at once. It sagged at the joints that had carried everything. A runner dropped to his knees and crawled. Then stopped crawling. A small group tried to pull the machine guns back into play and found they were already gone. Dawson moved 40 yards this time because counters are clever and patience keeps you alive. She kept low and let the snow carry her weight instead of fighting for speed. The hide rebuilt itself in a few practice motions that belonged to muscle more than thought. She checked the bubble level, rechecked natural point of aim, and ignored the urge to glance back. On the floor, Hospital Corpsman Second Class Miguel Rivera stole a few breaths of safety that had not existed 10 minutes ago. He turned pressure into treatment and treatment into movement and opened a lane for a casualty who had waited too long. He checked seals and tourniquets and refused to hurry simply because the world felt kinder. Care is still sequence even when the air finally lets you think. Dawson let the world shrink to a final piece of structure that needed to fall at the right time. A small leader tried to gather retreat into an organized pull that could turn back into a push if fear loosened. She understood that rank is not always visible, but tempo is. The person who held the timing became the last problem worth a bullet. She took the measure of the wind and used the bracket she had drawn for this exact moment. The hold lived inside the reticle where 1/10 of a mil feels like a mile. She let herself note spin drift and then demoted it behind the weight of the wind. Confirm. Adjust. Alv. And a simple follow-through that treated success like a neutral fact. The rhythm on the slope unspooled. A retreat that might have grown spine dissolved into people protecting their own skin. The mortar did not find the bowl again because there was no voice to make it both patient and accurate. The machine gun stayed quiet because shoulders that might have picked them up no longer had the courage to try. Movement in the bowl changed shape the way a body stands after a heavy load is set down. Captain Noah Mercer shifted from pure survival to exploitation inside the limits of the weather. He gave short instructions that turned openings into ground held. Never pretending the storm had surrendered. Park set buddy rushes only when suppression made sense and refused to write checks with people he could not afford to spend. Dawson kept firing to a minimum and kept decisions clean. She put a stop to one last figure who tried to build a rear guard at the edge of a draw where Marines needed to pass. She did not chase bodies because bodies were not the goal. Control was the goal, and control was already cracking. She repositioned after each solution and forced any counter to hunt a ghost that never stayed put. 10 yards when a small angle needed changing. 30 when lines might have traced back along a perfect path toward her. 40 when her own sense said a careful listener might be hearing a pattern she could break with distance alone. Her internal call of impact stayed a quiet habit. She did not celebrate, and she did not doubt. She noted the effect on the slope and on the bowl, and put a mark in her head beside the choice that had brought her here. The body needs markers, but the soul prefers silence during work that carries a cost. The long window she had given herself began to narrow again as weather reminded everyone who owned the valley. The ceiling sank a little, and wind pushed flat light into flatter. The bowl widened by perception because fear drained from shoulders and made space where there had been none. Rivera moved a casualty to a better handoff point that did not exist an hour ago. Mercer kept hold of what was gained without fooling himself about what remained. He prevented push into stupid places and stopped pull that would have given away the ground that mattered. He kept fires short and correct and stopped people from writing their own heroic versions of what had worked. The company rediscovered restraint at the same time it rediscovered choice. Dawson took stock of her ammunition without touching the magazine and felt the rough math of rounds left. She checked the Kestrel not for permission but for verification that the valley still told the truth. The streamers answered in a way that required no translation. She stayed ready for one more necessary correction and then found there were none that served the plan. She let the rifle go quiet and allowed her hands to grow still again. She watched the floor reorganize into something that looked less like desperation and more like survival. The comms in her ear remained receive only, and she let them carry the same clean rhythm they had carried all day. She had acted inside a logic that had been forced, and then she had stopped the moment the logic changed. The final minutes of the hour stretched in the way calm makes time elastic. The bowl turned from trap to ground held under winter. The slope stopped being a machine and started being a place where individuals made separate decisions. The chain she had mapped was gone, and nothing rose to replace it. Dawson eased behind the glass and let her heart rate drift down to its resting cadence. She kept the bubble level steady because habit is not something you set down just because the fight has moved. She closed her eyes once, opened them, and found the reticle where she had left it. The valley breathed, and she breathed with it. She stayed in place long enough to be certain that silence was not a trick. She scanned each lane, checked each shelf, and waited for a pattern to threaten a return. Nothing arrived that deserved another shot. She allowed herself the small relief that comes when a long choice ends without pretending the choice had been light. The work had lived inside discipline and inside a set of truths that respected the wind and the ground. The wind had been the teacher and the judge. The ground had been the ally and the limit. The rifle had been only the pen that wrote the necessary lines. Below, Marines who had been frozen by angles began to move with caution that did not waste what had been bought. Rivera used the new lanes to turn triage into treatment and treatment into stability. Park managed risk like a miser and opened space only when suppression could keep it open. Mercer kept the whole shape inside, a calm that made people trust their next step. Dawson laid a glove over the scope and let the cold have the exterior, while she kept the internals warm with nothing but patience. She did not speak, did not transmit, did not invite questions that did not need answers. She carried the quiet the way a professional carries a ruck that fits right. The choice that had started as a weight now lived as a memory she would file with care. The hour closed with the storm still owning the sky, but not the ground. The mortar stayed blind because the eye was gone. The machine guns stayed down because the hands that fed them were scattered. The node stayed quiet because there was no one left to give it breath. Dawson kept her eye on the ridge for one more slow loop, then let the reticle settle on nothing in particular. She felt the tired that comes after perfect concentration and let it wash past without making decisions. The tripod sighed into the crust and the rifle rested, like a tool that had done exactly what it was built to do. The valley held. And so did she. The first sign of change was rhythm, not noise. Fire from the slopes faded in a pattern that repeated enough times to feel deliberate. Captain Noah Mercer recognized the opening and treated it as borrowed time. He shifted Bravo Company from holding ground to shaping it, careful to keep risk inside the lines that winter allowed. Orders moved in short bursts that matched the weather. Mercer pushed a squad to the western spine with a clear task to seize the small rise that overlooked the bowl. Another team slid to a knuckle of rock that could anchor a pivot if the slope relaxed. The intent was simple: take edges that matter and avoid ground that only looks brave. Sergeant Ethan Park tightened fire control before anyone chased shadows. He set sectors so fields did not stack, then marked a narrow lane for movement that would not cross friendly muzzles. When a rifle choked, he ran the correction by reflex. Tap, rack, reassess, and handed the lane back without drama. Sling checks and light discipline followed each short move, so nothing shiny betrayed a shift. The M27 infantry automatic rifle became the metronome for each small advance. Short, controlled bursts pinned eyes where he wanted them, while 2 Marines stole 3 strides. Suppression stopped at the instant it could no longer buy distance. And rifles returned to economy. The pacing looked modest until you traced the ground taken in 10 minutes. Above them, Claire Dawson stayed invisible and honest about her lane. She did not transmit and did not invite traffic by accident. She kept Overwatch steady and trimmed pressure only when a node or a would-be rear guard tried to rebuild the chain that had broken. Every selective shot lived inside the pattern she had set earlier and never drifted toward vanity. The company adjusted to the new math with quiet competence. Marines checked laces and slings before each bound, then tucked in tight against the stone to cut their silhouette. A team leader cupped a hand over an optic to kill glare before peeking, then held a count for the next rush. Nothing looked cinematic. Everything looked correct. Park used terrain to cut exposure on the west spine. He stacked a pair behind a folded slab, tasked the M27 to hold a 30-degree wedge, and sent the next pair past with heads low. When a Marine slid on a sheet of ice, the partner covered the gap with a 2-round stitch that kept curious eyes down. They reached the rise and held it with elbow room for the automatic rifle. Rivera worked a corridor that finally existed and made it safe with repetition. He checked a tourniquet, reassessed pulses, replaced a slipping chest seal, and guided a litter across a shallow dish 1 step at a time. He signaled when to pause and when to breathe, and watched mouths for the ash color that warns of a drop. Care moved forward because the fight no longer sat directly on top of it. Mercer kept the bigger shape from unraveling. He refused to let success in one corner drag everyone into a rush. He redirected a fire team that started to hunt stragglers toward a shelf that actually mattered. The message was consistent. Focus on movers breaking east. Ignore scattered elements that have already lost posture. Dawson shifted her hide by 20 yards when angles thinned, then rebuilt position like a craftsman who trusts quiet steps. She checked natural point of aim and bubbled the level back to center. When a small group tried to re-establish a line on the east exit, she cut the pivot without touching anyone else. The effect felt like a door that almost latched and then swung open again. Bravo learned to read the distant help without naming it. Park called for suppression only when a window showed itself, not when hope asked for it. The M27 sang, in brief phrases, then went silent to cool and count. Rifles followed with pairs that belonged to targets, not to nerves. Movement turned tidy. Weapons stayed in muzzle awareness. And knees pointed down lanes that belonged to each Marine. No one drifted into a buddy's cone of fire. And no one forgot that rock throws ricochets in mean angles when snow turns to crust. The result was a line that moved like a zipper rather than a stampede. The push to the ridgeline came in 3 breaths instead of 1. First, a crawl to the base of the lip while the M27 held the shelf honest. Second, a half rise that closed the final body length under a short lull. Third, a coordinated pop just high enough to claim the crest without exposing spines. They owned the skyline only long enough to make it a wall for someone else. Mercer redistributed ammunition without creating a pause the slope could punish. Marines called out counts in simple numbers and moved boxes by hand while muzzles kept watch. A light machine gun belt found the right pouch on the right Marine on the first try. Small details made the difference between momentum and a stall. Rivera and Park fell into a cadence that looked practiced even if this exact ground was new. When Park opened a lane, Rivera used it to move a casualty to a better pocket. When Rivera needed one more beat for a lift, Park gave a 2-second press that meant more than volume. They respected each other's timing, and the space stayed open. Dawson stayed on the north approach, while Bravo began to clear the bull's shoulder. Any figure that tried to turn the exodus into a managed pull met the same quiet consequence. She repositioned by 10 to 30 meters as needed, and kept the optic shaded so glare did not sketch her. The radio remained receive only, a promise she would not break at this stage. Skepticism faded without anyone saying a word. The first gains might have been luck. The next ones looked like work. And by the 4th shift, the company moved with a shared picture. The junior leaders stopped second-guessing and started anticipating the next rhythm. Trust settled in like warmth under a layered glove. Mercer shifted the main effort to a shallow saddle that gave observation down the east draw. He refused pursuit that would have traded discipline for a few dramatic minutes. Instead, he set a guard, built interlocking sectors, and gave simple guidance to hold the crest and watch the exits. The intent was to control the ground, not chase a story. Park corrected a small jam with the tap. Rack. Reassess, drill, and swapped a shooter to keep the lane covered. He checked sling tension on a Marine whose stock had started to float and fixed it before it caused a miss. He had 2 Marines adjust positions by 2 steps each, so their arcs kissed rather than overlapped. Deconfliction happened without argument because the rules were clear. Rivera used the now stable perimeter to formalize CASEVAC inside the bull. He staged a handoff point behind a boulder that blocked wind and eyes, then marked a path that litter teams could follow, without tripping over prone shooters. He checked for shivering that had turned to stillness and put warm hands on cold skin to coach breath back towards steady. Treatment finally outran triage. Dawson eased down to a lower notch and kept a narrow lane on the far ridge where a single rifle could still cause trouble. She saw a lone figure try to rally a rear guard and watched long enough to confirm intent. One selective shot cut the idea before it turned into a line. She moved again so no one could draw a straight arrow back to her. By late afternoon, the bull stopped feeling like a weight on Bravo's chest. The company held the key terrain and the exits that mattered, and the storm wrote softer lines across the slopes. The net stayed professional, and the guidance from Battalion fit the shape on the ground. No one mentioned a shooter on the ridge, but a word started to move in low voices anyway. Ghost traveled without introduction. It did not need a story because form had said enough. Marines do not waste praise on luck, and they do not rebuild trust without a cause. What spread was respect for timing, economy, and hands that stayed calm when the day tried to take that from everyone. Mercer ended the push with a posture that could hold through another weather turn. He set depth behind the crest, posted eyes where they could see without becoming targets, and kept the automatic rifle where it could change a mind in 1 second. He kept people from writing their own epilogues in places where the map still had teeth. The company moved from surviving to shaping and then to holding without a stumble. Dawson remained a quiet constant on the ridge. She watched, measured, and only touched the fight when a thread threatened to reweave. Her lane stayed narrow by choice and by order. And that narrow lane was enough. The battlefield found a new rhythm, and Bravo walked in step with it, disciplined and unafraid. The sky finally loosened its grip in a way that felt real. Clouds lifted just enough to show seams above the ridgelines, and the wind fell under 25 knots for the first time all day. Captain Noah Mercer took the hint and began to turn a hold into an exit. He called for the company to consolidate on the western ridgeline, where the rock gave depth instead of drama. The plan ran in 2 clear tracks. A feint would bloom with smoke and controlled fire to the east to make the slope watch the wrong doorway. The real path would run through a narrow draw to the north, where snow had settled into firm steps. Bravo would move in waves with discipline, each wave short enough to live inside the weather window. Claire Dawson stayed a ridge away and measured her breath to the new rhythm. Her Mk13 Mod 7 sat quiet with a suppressor, and 5 or 6 rounds left that would only serve a purpose if rearguard fires threatened the corridor. She kept radio receive only, and did not break the silence that had guarded the work. The tripod took the weight, and the bubble level held true. At about 2:30 p.m., the ceiling nudged above 3,000 feet AGL. Pilots watching numbers a valley away began to talk with hope that sounded like professionalism. H-1Y Venom and CH-53E, crews prepared to push when the icing risk dipped below the line that ends arguments. The door was not open wide, but it was a door. Mercer moved first with smoke canisters climbing from the east edge. The feint grew in a slow breath rather than a roar, and pulled eyes with short bursts from an M27 infantry automatic rifle. The M27 played metronome again, holding a clean cadence without running hot. It kept heads down without inviting a duel the company did not need. The first buddy team dropped into the northern draw and moved the way good teams move. One Marine laid brief suppression. The partner stole 3 strides. Then they traded places. Tap. Rack. Reassess. Lived in their hands. When a rifle hiccuped, and the lane stayed covered without panic. Muzzles kept their own lanes, so arcs did not collide. Rivera used the space to turn care into motion. He tightened a tourniquet on a leg that had begun to leak again, then secured a litter strap that had loosened in the cold. He checked breathing, set a seal that had lifted at the edge, and tapped a shoulder with a look that meant it was time to move. The first casualty traveled the short stretch to a staging pocket behind a folded rock. On the ridgeline, Sergeant Ethan Park set a small base of fire that would not outshoot the plan. The M27 stitched 2 short phrases at the mouth of the draw, then cooled while rifles carried the next measure. Park corrected a shooter's sling and kept 2 Marines from overlapping fields with a quiet hand and a point. He used the ground like a tool and let the plan set the pace. Dawson watched the edge of the enemy's withdrawal. Rearguard hands tried to build a last rake across the true route. She read the wind by streamers and confirmed what her kestrel already said, then took a single clean shot that turned a line into a loose thread. She slid 10 meters along the rocks and built the hide again before anyone could draw a straight arrow in return. The second wave moved when the first wave settled into the pocket halfway down the draw. Suppression was short and honest and came only when a step actually needed it. Park corrected a magazine that had not seated with a firm tug and a nod, and the Marine returned to his lane without losing rhythm. Every correction kept the plan from bleeding time. At 3:10 p.m., the first H-1Y Venom broke into the valley with caution and intent. The airframe rode the thin air with power to spare now that the ceiling had lifted. The bird eased toward the western crest where Mercer had shaped a landing spot with common sense rather than tools. The crew chief scanned, confirmed, and opened the door for priority casualties. Rivera delivered the first 2 patients with a litter team that moved like a single body. He passed a quick report with short words that mattered, then handed off cleanly. He checked his remaining supplies, warmed his hands for a count, and returned to the staging pocket without letting adrenaline write bad decisions. The lane to the helicopter stayed open because everyone protected it. The feint to the east burned steady, but did not grow greedy. Smoke curled and drifted low as the wind shifted. In short bursts, kept eyes fixed on a lie that served a purpose. Mercer reinforced only enough to keep the illusion alive while the real work happened in the north. He did not let attention wander. And no one broke script. Dawson picked one more rear guard who tried to turn the east feint into a chance for pain. She confirmed. Adjusted a tenth for the push that rolled down the ridge. And solved with a press that felt like a breath held. The figure dropped, and the small knot behind him lost the nerve to harden. She moved another 20 meters. Shaded the glass. And checked natural point of aim again. The draw narrowed and forced a careful flow. Buddy teams cut exposure by crouching under a lip where ice had set into firm steps. When a Marine slipped, the partner's muzzle stayed on lane while a gloved hand hauled him back to traction. Discipline made the difference between a pause and a fall. The second helicopter, H-1Y arrived with rotor wash that pulled snow into a pale halo. The pilot held steady while crew guided litters with gloved hands and shouted eyes. The big bird took weight, then lifted clean to avoid overpressure near the ridge. The valley did not forgive mistakes, and none were made. Park kept count aloud in a voice that stayed low. He tracked who had passed the midpoint and who still needed a lane. Ammunition moved from those who had more to those who had less. One magazine at a time, with tags and nods. The M27 returned to work only when movement needed a barrier. Rivera stabilized one more chest and staged two walking, wounded behind a boulder that blocked the wind like a wall. He checked for shivering that had turned to rigidity and warned of the slide that comes before collapse. He wrapped a blanket under a plate carrier and passed a patient to a hand that could carry weight. The corridor to the birds held and then held again. Dawson felt her remaining rounds as a count she did not want to burn. She saved them for hands that meant to claw at the northern exit. When a pair tried to plant a weapon behind a slab that looked into the draw, she cut the move before it formed a thought. She shifted 30 meters this time and buried her track with the side of her forearm. Mercer pulled the western crest into a tighter arc as the last third of the company moved. He set interlocking sectors that kissed rather than overlapped and kept a reserve ready to plug a sudden leak. He reminded everyone to avoid chasing stragglers and to protect the draw. The mission now was to leave ground clean, not to write a final push. The weather began to lean toward closing. The wind ticked up and the ceiling thinned in places that made pilots watch the edges. One more H-1Y slid into position with restraint and made room for the next set of litters. The clock pressed again, like fingers on a door. Park sent the final buddy teams through the narrow and kept a last base of fire on the western lip. The M27 spoke and then cooled. Spoke and then cooled. Never outrunning its duty cycle. A rifle coughed. Tap. Rack. Reassess fixed it. And the lane did not feel the hitch. The line shortened until only a thin shell remained on the crest. Rivera counted his patients and matched tags to faces in the wash of rotor and snow. He found one more who hid in the corner of his vision and guided him with a hand on the elbow. He looked once toward the draw and decided he had what he could carry. The corridor remained protected to the end. Dawson took a last look at the ridge where trouble could still form. She did not see a pattern gather itself. She held her fire and kept her breath even. The rifle sat ready anyway. Because readiness is not bravado. The final helicopter lifted into the weak light while snow turned circles in the rotor wash. The numbers for the 50 Marines settled with their own weight. 11 killed in action. 19 wounded in action. And the rest leaving the valley with boots and breath. No one liked the count. And everyone understood that it could have been a wall of names. Mercer stepped into the last chalk with a glance that made sure the crest stayed covered until the moment it did not matter. Park climbed after the perimeter was set to collapse in the right order. Rivera stayed with the last patient's hand until the cable touches and noise made words useless. The birds rose in a stagger that fit the window. Dawson stayed on the ridge through the lift and the long second after it. She watched for the stray shape that sometimes thinks a last shot can change the story. Nothing came that deserved a round. She let the hide breathe and then began the ritual of leaving. She cleared the position the way a professional clears a memory. Brass policed. Cards and tape tucked away. Glass shaded. Tripod folded. Sling checked. She brushed her track with the side of an arm and the heel of a glove. Then moved. Her radio remained on receive, only because there was nothing useful to add. The net carried the clipped voices of crews and controllers as they rode the edge of the weather toward safer air. At about 4:15 p.m., the ceiling started to sag again, and the valley took back its gray. Dawson was already a ridge away, quiet as frost, and gone. Snow still clung to the flight line when the helicopters touched down and the valley folded back into weather behind them. The battalion spoke in low voices that sounded like work, not relief. And the ground crews moved with the quiet pace of people who have done this before. By 2:30 p.m., the casualty flow had reached the medical tent, and the first status boards turned from blank to filled. The numbers matched what the company had carried out of the bowl, and everyone understood what they meant. Lieutenant Colonel Adam Whitaker took the corner desk near the operations map and opened the template for an after-action report. The headings felt familiar in his hands, and the rhythm steadied the room. Major Karen Bishop set the timeline with marks that matched radio logs and aircraft tracks. She built the sequence with times that could be verified and left feelings where they belonged. They wrote the first paragraph like a report and not a story. Weather was the first condition, not the last. And the word said, low ceiling, icing, winds, and visibility in plain order. They recorded that the enemy initiated contact from multiple positions with machine guns and indirect fire directed by a forward observer. They noted that the battalion maintained control of the net and that Bravo Company held as ordered while ground was consolidated. The second paragraph captured the pivot when the sky opened enough to allow an ingress. It stated that helicopters entered during a narrow weather window and executed priority casualty movement in waves. It confirmed that the company exfiltration used a northern draw, and that a feint to the east helped fix attention away from the true route. It explained that the plan followed standard tactics and that control measures stayed intact. The casualty section did not blink. 11 killed in action. 19 wounded in action. The balance of the 50 Marines accounted for and returned to the forward base. The numbers sat on the page without decoration because respect is not noise. Major Bishop reviewed all radio excerpts and cut anything that could not be tied to a time and a call sign. She added a line that enemy pressure diminished after key positions fell silent, then linked that statement to observed effects, not conjecture. She recorded precision effects on enemy fighting positions without assigning a source that could not be proven. She left space for attachments that showed terrain sketches and damage photographs. Colonel Laura Keating arrived at the operations table and read from top to bottom without asking for flourishes. She placed a finger on the weather window and asked what changed between 2:20 p.m. and 3:10 p.m. Major Bishop answered with ceiling values and icing reports from aviation and ground sensors. Keating accepted the numbers and declined to fill the gap with assumptions. A secure call from higher headquarters arrived before 4:10 p.m. and sounded like a checklist. The questions focused on feasibility, timing, and risk. Keating gave the measured truth about the helicopters, the draw, and the limits that remained. She did not name a hidden hand in the fight because the report did not name it, and she would not guess. Whitaker and Bishop closed the after-action report with language that matched the rest. Enemy withdrew under sustained pressure and terrain control. Friendly forces maintained command and control, executed a controlled withdrawal, and preserved combat power. Casualties were significant, but lower than projections given weather, terrain, and fire. No speculation appeared in the paragraphs, and no single actor was placed where verification did not reach. Back on the company side, Bravo returned to the forward base and turned the noise of rotors into the quiet of routine. Captain Noah Mercer gathered his Marines in sections so the room would not boil with too many voices. His debrief was short and precise, and sounded like a standard he had not made up that day. He reviewed what worked, what did not, and what would be done differently when weather writes the first line. He wrote the numbers on a board that was not there to impress anyone. 11 killed in action, 19 wounded in action. He named the non-commissioned officers who kept lanes clean and the teams that moved when movement mattered. He thanked Hospital Corpsman Second Class Miguel Rivera for TCCC under fire and for CASEVAC coordination inside a bowl that had not wanted to let anyone go. Rivera stood near the back and checked his kit while people filed past to shake a hand or touch a shoulder. He had done what training taught and what experience corrects. And he had done it at the pace the day allowed. He counted gauze and seals and scribbled a short list of what needed to be packed before sundown. The steps meant as much as any speech, because steps are how people come home. In the barracks and in the hallways. A story moved without needing a narrator. It traveled by the marks on enemy positions that looked like one shot to vital areas at the right time. It moved with the memory of machine guns that went quiet and a mortar that never found its voice again. It carried a quiet word that sounded like a name without a page. The operations shop treated rumor like weather. They listened without writing and watched patterns without reaching conclusions. They aligned times when the enemy chain went slack with times on the radio log and left it there. The after-action report stayed accurate because accuracy is the only currency that keeps trust. Claire Dawson returned to base with the same silence that had guarded her work. The rifle was cleaned and the kit was dried and stowed before the first hot meal reached the company area. She submitted her own reconnaissance notes with details that matched her lane. Observe and report still fit on the line that asked for mission description. Her file carried one old page that mattered more now because it had shaped how her hands behaved in the snow. Years earlier, she had acted to stop a clear and imminent threat and had received a letter of reprimand for stepping outside an order of battle that required patience. The letter had not ended her career because competence and judgment are slow arguments that can be won. She kept MOS 0317 and learned where the lines rest and how to hold them until they move. The battalion adjutant walked a set of personnel actions through the offices without any need for ceremony. A transfer request sat on top of the manila folder with a destination that made sense for the next chapter. Advanced Sniper Instructor course at Stone Bay sat in clean print, and Quantico appeared as the alternate if seat dates shifted. The message inside was firm and respectful by design. Colonel Keating and Lieutenant Colonel Whitaker signed where signatures were required. The orders did not attach a public citation to a specific day or a specific valley. They did not gild what had always depended on discipline and restraint. They simply moved a professional to a place where she would turn skill into instruction for people who would need it. No one spoke of court-martial because the report did not accuse, and the commanders did not hunt ghosts when the mission had ended well within the bounds of truth. Rules of engagement existed to protect people from their own certainty and to keep coordination inside a common frame. Everyone involved understood the reason for the rules and the limits written into them. Everyone also understood that results come from people who can hold two ideas at once and still do the right thing. Bravo Company turned toward the next tasking, with gear squared away and heads a little heavier and a little clearer. The armory closed with a thud that always sounds the same whether a day has been easy or hard. The motor pool shook out the fine snow that creeps into every seam and signed the last line on a maintenance log. The forward base exhaled the way a body does after a cold run. Night settled over the tents, and the thin walls turned the world into a circle of warm air and low light. In the medical tent, Dawson sat under a blanket that had the smell of storage and the feeling of home. Her fingers tingled as heat returned, and the ache found the places where hours of stillness had taken their toll. A cup of something hot lived in both hands, while she let the noise of people alive fill the space. She turned the day over in her head, without editing it into something it had not been. Discipline had kept her hands steady and had saved lives by keeping actions tied to logic instead of adrenaline. Precision had made every small choice count and had kept the rifle from becoming a blunt answer to a sharp problem. Humanity had placed the work inside a frame that respected every face on the floor and every name on the board. The thought that lingered did not ask for a medal or a mention. It asked whether she had kept faith with the standard that makes Marines trust one another on bad days. It asked whether the choice to act had been clean when weighed against the order to wait. It asked whether she could carry both answers and still teach the next Marine to keep the line. By 7:15 a.m. the next morning, the after-action report had moved through the regiment and into the stack at division. General Thomas Hale's staff read it for what it was and accepted the clean language that lived between weather and will. The chain had done what a chain is supposed to do. It had turned facts into guidance and left legend to the places where legend belongs. Dawson's orders arrived in a plain envelope that looked like any other piece of mail in a field environment. The words inside were simple and correct, and carried a date that gave her time to recover her hands and her sleep. Stone Bay waited to trade her field kit for a whiteboard and a range. And she felt ready for the trade. Teaching would be another form of Overwatch, just with different glass. She folded the paper and slid it into her pocket and thought about the men and women who would stand behind tripods in wind and cold and trust the math. She planned the first class in her head and decided it would begin with natural point of aim, wind reading, and patience. She would tell them that a weapon is a responsibility and a promise, not a wish. She would tell them that restraint is a skill, not a pause. The camp settled into the soft lull that marks the space between tasks. Rivera checked on his patients and filled a quiet with small instructions that sounded like life. Park walked the line once more and made sure sloppy habits had not crept back in under the blanket of relief. Mercer signed the last line on a report and closed the folder with a steady hand. The story of the valley would survive in boot prints on the floor of a helicopter and in pencil lines on a sketch map. It would live in the way a machine gun team set their sector an inch lower next time, and in the way a corpsman warmed his hands before he touched skin. It would live in an automatic rifle that fired in short phrases, and in a radio that stayed quiet until words were useful. It would live without needing to be named. When lights dimmed, Dawson let her head rest against canvas and counted breaths the way she had on the ridge. She felt the body release the day one muscle at a time. She thought about the order of things and the way rank and duty shape choices and keep people aligned. She decided that some days rank stands behind life and lets a human being step forward, and that the standard still holds either way. She slept with a clear mind and a steady pulse. Morning would bring packing and one more walk to the armory to sign a line and return a serial number. Morning would also bring the quiet satisfaction of work done to standard and a path that continued because the system knew how to recognize value without shouting about it. The name would stay off the page, and the lesson would not. You have walked with Bravo Company through cold, silence, and choices that did not come with comfort. Now the question comes to you with the same quiet weight that sat on the ridge. If you stood where Staff Sergeant Claire Dawson lay in the snow and the window was closing, would you hold to orders or lean into instinct to protect lives? Think about how discipline keeps a team together and how a single decision can change the shape of a day. Orders exist for a reason that is older than any one story. They hold a unit inside the same frame so that every Marine understands the next move without hearing it. Instinct is not guesswork when it is built on training, repetitions, and calm. Where would you draw the line between the rule that protects the many and the moment that asks one person to act? In the valley, everything depended on timing, control, and quiet courage. The plan bent only when weather allowed and not a second earlier. Skill lived in small actions done well under stress. When you think about your own life, where have you felt that press of time and duty? And which part of you stepped forward? Some of you have stood in formations where a last-minute change kept people safe. Some of you have worked inside teams where one calm voice steadied many. Others know the feeling of being the new person who learns by watching small habits done right. Share a moment when discipline helped your group. And tell us what you learned from that day. Medical care under fire is not a story about heroics. It is a story about sequence, massive bleeding, airway, breathing, circulation, and exposure are not just words on a card. They are steps that bring people home. If you have training in tactical combat casualty care or first aid in any setting, share a tip that helped you keep a clear head when your hands began to shake. There is also a question about credit and how it finds people. Public praise can lift morale, but quiet recognition can protect a mission while it continues. When the fight is not over, which kind of recognition do you believe serves the unit best? Tell us how your school, team, or workplace balances gratitude with good judgment. If this story moved you, leave a comment with your view on orders versus instinct. Keep it thoughtful and grounded in what you would actually do. Like this video if you believe discipline and humanity must walk side by side. Subscribe to follow more true to standard United States Marine Corps storytelling about teamwork, leadership, and decisions under pressure. Share this with someone who has served or with a friend who cares about how people make hard choices. Let them add their voice to a respectful conversation. If you are a veteran, know that your experience is honored here. We welcome lessons learned while protecting your privacy and the privacy of those who stood with you. When you speak in the comments, keep it civil, specific, and useful. Avoid sensitive details that do not belong in public. Stay away from naming units, dates, or locations that could put someone at risk. Explain your reasoning and be open to learning from someone who lived a different part of the same problem. Take a breath and sit with this final thought. In any organization built on trust, discipline is the map, and instinct is the compass. The map keeps everyone together. The compass finds the path when the terrain has changed since the brief. Think about your own ridge. Whatever that may be, maybe it is a late shift on a hospital floor, a long drive in bad weather, or a call you need to make before the day closes. What does discipline look like there? And how do you protect the people beside you? Leave one sentence that someone else could use when their hands begin to shake. If you want more stories told with care, for details, and respect for the people behind them, tap subscribe. You will find cold nights, tight plans, and quiet professionals who keep the standard. You will also find the small lessons that live in clean routines and short words. This channel exists to lift the parts of service that feel human. We will keep honoring veterans by listening more than we speak. We will ask what helped, what made things harder, and what could make the next person safer. We will protect privacy and keep the focus on skill, not legend. Your insights can make that promise more true with every video. For those who train others, take one idea from this story into your next session. Maybe it is the habit of confirming natural point of aim before anything else. Maybe it is the way a leader uses short, clear orders to turn risk into action. Share what you plan to teach this week and how you will measure that it's stuck. For those who are learning, pick one practice worth repeating until it is muscle memory. It could be how to breathe when the clock is loud. It could be how to pass a quick status in 3 words that someone can use. Tell us what you will practice at 7:15 a.m. tomorrow, and then come back and say how it went. If you served, you know that not every success ends with a ceremony. Sometimes the best work leaves no name on the page. If that rings true for you, write a few lines about the standard you held and why it mattered. Your quiet example will help someone who is just starting out. If you have never worn a uniform, you still live inside teams that depend on trust. Your version of an after-action report might be a family talk after a hard week or a meeting after a rough shift. What would you change next time? And what will you keep because it worked? Leave one lesson you would hand to a friend who is about to face their own storm. We end where the day in the valley ended, with people who kept their heads, shared their strength, and trusted one another through pressure. With leaders who respected the limits of weather and the reach of a plan, with a shooter who stayed quiet and kept faith with a simple promise to protect life. Thank you for watching and for adding your voice with care. Comment your view on orders versus instinct, and tell us a time when you chose one or balanced both. Like, if you believe that discipline and compassion belong together, subscribe for more steady, respectful stories of training, teamwork, and the moments that test both. Share this with someone who could use a reminder that calm is a skill. Share it with someone who teaches others to breathe in, breathe out, and act with purpose. Help us keep the tone steady and the facts clean. Help us keep the focus on people over noise. Carry this closing line with you into whatever valley waits ahead. Discipline, precision, and humanity are the three things that bring people home safe. Keep them together. Build habits that hold when the wind rises. And lend your steadiness to the person beside you.